Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go, the official podcast of Washington Policy Center. David Boze, Communications Director, here as your host. This edition of the Washington Policy Podcast on the Go is literally on the go. I'm actually taking Jason Mercier, our Government Reform Center Director, to the airport, and I thought, why waste time in the car? Why not get the lowdown on the governor's latest tax and budget proposals? Jason, over to you.
Yeah, the only thing more fun than Seattle traffic is talking about an income tax, right?
That's right.
And unfortunately, once again, that's what we're going to get to talk about. What the governor did yesterday, it's kind of mind-boggling if you think about it. We are in the midst of record economic growth, over $4 billion of new revenue that would facilitate almost a 10% increase in spending for this new budget, and that was not sufficient for the governor. He proposed over a 20% increase in spending, facilitated by $4 billion in new taxes. Not only tax increases on service industries through the business and occupation tax, but a 9% standalone capital gains income tax. And I say that on purpose, an income tax.
Now hold on, Jason. I keep hearing that there is no income tax. There's just a capital gains tax in the governor's plan. But critics say that it's an income tax.
Yeah, critics and opponents. So let's see, who would be in the camp of opponents and critics if that's who defines what a capital gains tax is. So in that camp is going to be California, Oregon, New Jersey, New York, Hawaii. You know what? In fact, every state in the country, including the Internal Revenue Service for the federal government, every single tax authority in the country has seemed to make it pretty clear that a tax on capital gains income is an income tax. For some reason, that message gets lost once we come over here to the great Northwest part of the country. But, I mean, they know it. This really isn't a debate. This really isn't uncertain. They know it's an income tax, but the problem that they have is underneath the state constitution, a graduated income tax is illegal. You would need to have a constitutional amendment to impose that. And to their credit, over the last 80 years, they've tried. They've sent the voters 6 constitutional amendments, and the voters have said, no, thank you. So the voters aren't cooperating. What am I going to do if I want an income tax? Well, let's see if I can get the judges to do my dirty work for me, and that's what this is really all about.
To redefine what an income tax is, or call this tax something else so that you can pretend it's not an income tax, get it in there, but if it does get in there, it becomes... Washington State becomes eligible for all kinds of progressive income taxes. Would that be right?
You cannot have a capital gains tax unless you are allowed to tax every form of income. You can't have one without the other. So what will happen if somehow the legislature were to agree with this just massive tax increase in budget spending and adopt this proposal? It will result in a lawsuit. It will go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will do a couple of possible things. There is no way in the world that they rule this as an excise tax. They just can't. They're going to look at the IRS, they're going to look at every other state in the country, and they're going to look at the actual incidence of the tax. It is on income. Now, at that point, the question is, what does the court do next? Do they take that next step and say, well, yeah, this is an income tax, but you know what? We think that those multiple rulings that our predecessors have put out over the past 80 years saying that income is property were wrong. Income's not property, and you can go ahead and have an income tax without a constitutional amendment. That's the end game. That's what they're hoping for.
So now, setting aside the capital gains income tax issue, which is a big one, obviously, you also pointed out you've got the governor proposing a 20% increase in spending, but you've pointed out that that's all the more remarkable based on the revenue that we've been collecting as a state for the last few years.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, if you look over the last 10 years, state revenues have almost doubled. It's almost 80% increase in amount of money that the taxpayers have been providing. And that has facilitated some record increases in spending, a lot of it driven to the Supreme Court's K-12 McCleary ruling for education, but that has been satisfied. The court has signed off on that. So it's now to see the governor, after we have approval for the Supreme Court on our plans, after the legislature's already raised our property taxes to fund that, take this new economic growth and instead say, you know what? The taxpayers have been doing their job, and we really haven't provided them any relief. So, I mean, we look at this and say, this is a time for a sales tax cut. The governor looks at this and says, I want to do so much more than I can do with 10% increase in revenue, so I'm going to propose a tax increases, and we're going to double spending. We're going to make it higher than it's ever been before. And I guess what makes this even all the more puzzling is, we're not in a recession, and we aren't seeing that on the horizon, but there are some indications, and the fact that we are on a record-long economic expansion, at some point that's going to change. So why would you want to overextend the state so much, realizing if you do that, you're going to have to immediately come right back in and cut all these new programs or raise taxes even higher?
Well, that brings me back to the capital gains taxes. One of the things that proponents of this capital gains income tax have been making is they've been saying that we need this stable source of additional funding for various programs. But you've pointed out that the capital gains tax is not stable, especially in times of recession.
Well, Dave, I know that we're driving, so when I say this, don't lose control of the car, okay? We need to listen to the state of California. Yeah, we need to listen to the outgoing governor, Jerry Brown, who advocated for a constitutional amendment in California to stop using capital gains for their budget because it was destroying the sustainability of their programs. It's incredibly unpredictable. It's not stable. And he said, we can't do this anymore. It's making our budgeting impossible. So we need to pass a constitutional amendment to not spend that money and instead put it into reserve accounts. So if California can figure out this is not a good way to budget, maybe, just maybe, Washington can.
Does this end up being like a piece of a triangulation game where, because both houses and the governor's office are all controlled by the same party, if he comes out with the biggest budget and the biggest ask and others come out with half that, even though half that's still 10% increase on top of record revenue increases, they can say, well, look at what a low budget, a fiscally responsible budget that we're promoting. What are your thoughts on that?
We already know this budget is dead on arrival. We heard yesterday from the budget writer for the Democrats in the Senate saying, it's a good recommendation, it's a good start, we're going to take it into consideration, but the legislature does not have the appetite for this size of a tax increase, although she thinks that some might be warranted. So when you look at the fact we just had an election, you have a lot of new lawmakers, you have a lot of new freshmen, I have a hard time believing in the midst of record economic growth, with no budget crisis, that the very first vote these folks are going to want to take is to raise taxes and try to go back home to their districts and say that. So looking in my crystal ball for next session, there will probably be some tax increases passed, but we're not going to see a $4 billion tax package go through the legislature.
You've been calling, and Washington Policy Center has been recommending the sales tax cut. At least part of the legislative discussion now is around that sales tax cut. How do you see this whole thing playing out, particularly while one party overwhelmingly won in terms of both houses and the governor's office that they now control, the voters actually turned down two major taxes and showed a strong dislike of the idea of additional taxes. And Washington Policy Center poll earlier this year in 2018 also showed a strong disdain for new additional taxes. Where do you think that's going to come into play, and does that leave wiggle room for the possibility anyway of a tax cut somewhere?
Well, there were many eye-opening moments of the governor's tax press conference yesterday, and one of the most surprising answers that he gave is he was asked, so you're proposing all of these tax increases, but we're not seeing any tax relief for the sales tax or the property tax to help provide these resources back to those that may need them. So why did you not do that? And the governor's response was, he thinks it is better to spend money on those on the low-income side versus giving them tax relief, because if tax relief is provided to them, it will be provided to others. It was just a shocking statement. So it doesn't look like the governor is going to be advocating for that, but we have seen in prior proposals out of the legislature, we do know that sales tax cut will be proposed. You'll probably see some property tax reductions proposed. So I think from the legislature standpoint, they realize they're going to have to provide some sort of tax relief. The question is, what size and what games do they play in that? Is the message the legislature says, hey, we'll give you a little bit of money over here if you allow us to impose an income tax? They've tried that in the past, and the voters have said no thank you.
You can prepare yourself to follow Olympia and what's happening in the legislative session. You can go to our social media pages and like the Washington Policy and follow the Washington Policy Center's Facebook page, our Twitter feed. Olympia Watch is Jason Mercier's Twitter feed. So be sure to follow that as well. And subscribe at washingtonvotes.org to follow key votes and get a weekly update on key activities in the legislative session. This is David Boze, Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. Been here with Jason Mercier, our Government Reform Center Director, here for the Washington Policy Center's official podcast, Washington Policy on the Go, the first ever actual podcast when we were actually on the go in the car. Be sure to tune in next week, and thanks so much for listening.